name is Alex, and this is Bento Radio. Now, before we get into today's review, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping here. First, good things first. I just got my 4-day pass for Anime NYC, so ordered those on time for at-home delivery. They should be arriving pretty soon, and I'll probably post an image of it on the screen here somewhere if you are watching this on YouTube. But you should have your passes pretty quickly. I managed to actually get a full 4-day pass, and then hilariously I got approved as press, so I actually have to, I think, get this refunded. I gotta reread some stuff, but anyway, you should be getting those passes pretty quickly if you order them in time, because I got mine, and that is next month, being August 2025, at the end of the month. So if you're going to the convention and you hear me somewhere, don't be afraid to say hi. Don't bite, I promise. But on that note, speaking of YouTube, if anybody's watching on the YouTube channel, you may be wondering where the last episode was. And I did my What I'm Watching episode, which is a seasonal thing I do to, like, mention 5 shows that I'm looking at, and I'm, like, usually week to week as best I can. I am only one man and only human, after all. And as anybody who's been listening for long enough knows, this is not my full-time gig. With that said, I want to do something a little different, a little risky, but not out of the realm of stuff people do. Except, as I'm sure you take a look at any of my follower accounts, I am not a big account, which means that I am not, quote-unquote, whitelisted by all of the anime companies. Therefore, I am subject to the rules of copyright vis-a-vis YouTube, and where I can, I usually dispute them, because very often if I'm using a trailer section that will come after this intro, I rip the sound out of it. I make it pretty small, like you can still see it, but it's not the main focus of the video. And I clearly showing it to you for review. And I'm showing it to you in a transformative enough way where it usually doesn't trip anything. And if it does, I literally go in and I say, this is for review, therefore it opts out of, because it does. That's a thing that YouTube lets you do. I know there's a little bit of inside baseball, but I think it's important to tell you what happened to the last episode. There are some companies who you don't want to run the tripwire on, and Sony Music Japan is one of them. And I forgot to animate the, that is, the licensing, with the Mikadono sisters, is owned by Sony Music Japan. So even though I put myself in front of the trailer, I flipped the trailer, I took the sound out, this thing was not watchable as a trailer. They still nailed me. I to them in the same way that I always do, because it was a transformative thing and it was for review, at least I believed it was. And they copyright struck me. So I gotta be on my best behavior until October. So if you see any odd changes, that's definitely why. But, you are listening to the podcast, you don't care about this because you didn't see the video. But if you want to watch the podcast, you can go find me on YouTube. Just search Bento Radio and it should come right up, because I follow my account after that. But if you want to follow me on other things like Guy and or Threads, I'm at Alex Holt Cohan across all of those. I will actually put those links in the description on the page, so you can go check that out. And while you're over there, go check out the other videos I've done on other shows. You can also go find my webtoon, which has its first season completely out, all 12 episodes. Bullshit News over on Webtoon. So just search Bullshit News and that should come right up. I'm going to try and get my link game together here on YouTube because I think that's important. But on that note, I want to jump into what I want to talk about this week, and that's a little show from 2021 that actually is a pretty big show, and we'll get into why that is. That show is called Mushoku Tensei, Jobless Reincarnation. Now take it away, with a synopsis.
After dying in an accident at 34, a jobless and reclusive man finds himself reincarnated in a fantasy world as a baby named Rudeus Greyrat. Unlike his past life, where he wasted every opportunity, Rudeus vows to live without regrets. Armed with the memories of his former self, he quickly excels in magic, impressing even adult mages, and begins training under the talented Roxy. Growing up in a new world filled with swords, sorcery, and mythical creatures, Rudeus faces both external and internal challenges. He trains, forms relationships, and struggles to overcome the flaws he carried over from his past life. His journey takes a dark turn when a mysterious magical disaster scatters him and others across the world. Forced to survive in unknown lands, Rudeus embarks on a long journey to reunite with his family, gaining new allies like the fierce heiress Greyrat along the way. As he matures, Rudeus confronts the consequences of his actions, fights powerful enemies, and uncovers the deeper mysteries of the world and his reincarnation. Mushoku Tensei blends heartfelt character development, epic adventure, and raw emotion into a unique coming-of-age story about redemption and second chances.
Now, before I get into Jobless Reincarnation proper, I want to actually talk about a different show to start, because I think it's important to put Jobless Reincarnation and all of its beauty and warmth in context here. Every time I watch a show, and I've watched it through a couple times now, and part of the reason I'm doing this is it was announced that the new season is coming out in 2026. I believe it's coming out April 2026. The show, every time I've watched it, has meant more and more to me because it says something about you grow into and how the world around you affects it, and what nature has to do with what your surroundings have to do with your think of nature versus nurture, but what your surroundings have to do with your actual and your personality and all that other stuff. And a lot of people don't like Rudeus. So a lot of the fandom don't like Rudeus. A lot of the fandom don't like Paul. And I find myself at odds with that a lot. And to kind of why I want to talk about a different show real quick. And that show is actually Hakusho. There's a great episode in the very beginning of Yu Yu Hakusho. I think it might be the second or third episode, where Botan tells you cool down and about the offer of coming back to life and becoming a spirit detective a little bit more. And in the middle there, maybe go to your wake. And she clearly sends him to his wake, knowing what's about to happen to him, but he doesn't know because he's at that point in the show, but at the very beginning of the show when he dies, he is a delinquent. Very few people in his life believe in him, and even less outright tell him so. And the thing that people don't think about, because they're never really experienced it, is the effect of them not being present anymore will have. You don't think about how, you don't and can't oftentimes think about how much people you don't even really register will miss you when you're gone. And so much of appeals to people who are danger revolve around trying to prove that to them and trying to give them a little piece of that so they have a reason to still be present in the world. But at his wake, Yusuke sees the people who care about him in his life, the school's principal, Kuwabara, and his mother, and Keiko, deeply emotional and like part of the themes in a way that he never anticipated, that he never really thought about, because he's a punk kid who's been served, who up until that point, and kind of a show quietly, is served a raw deal by the world around him. The world around him doesn't have a structure for how to deal with that kind of kid. And this is something that's really common in less collectivist societies like America. If you go to a really good high-end school district, very often people don't know what to do with you if you're not that perfect kind of what they're anticipating students are. If you're too far in either direction, they don't know what to do with you. A hilarious version of this is when I was in school, I didn't do well academically. And it wasn't because I'm not smart. It wasn't because I'm not capable or I wasn't capable. It was because the trappings of a school environment, and specifically a school environment in which you're graded, didn't lend themselves for my success. And I'll tell you the funnier story and then the more interesting story second. But when I was in English, I was in they call special education English, or the derogatory term is bedhead English. And our English department every year focused on a different period of time. And in our junior year, that focus was on the Vietnam War. We read like Fall Apart, the like, listen to like all like war protest songs, Sun, and all that stuff. But our teacher stood in front of us and said to a room full of kids who are both technically, and in my case, at time and still, physically disabled, or quietly and loudly is a better way to put that actually, quietly and loudly disabled. What happens if there's a draft and you get drafted? In high schoolers, but even at that point we knew, like, a draft literally won't touch us. It just won't happen. And we all looked at her, and we all more or less laughed. And she tried to, like, a statement there by saying they could send you to the post office, to which I think either I or somebody else said out loud, "Oh, I'll work at the post office. That's a steady job." And that was like a little piece of how people don't know how to deal with too far outside of any expected ramification. And it's funny, but it's also a little sad. Now, the impressive thing that happened to me was I was in creative writing in my senior year. And it's, to this day, the only academic-based class that I did as well in as something like art, as any of the art classes I was in. I took all the art classes I could in school. I took every art class they offered, I'm pretty sure. And the reason was it was so focused on being creative, and the teacher at the jump said, "I'm not grading you on grammar, I'm not grading you on punctuation, I'm barely grading you on spelling. I want you to be creative in this class, and I don't want to put up those barriers to you attempting things beyond what you may be capable of if you have to worry about how many commas are in a sentence or where the period goes or any of that stuff." And I struggled to get a C- in at best in English, got an A- in that class because I didn't have to worry about all of the constraints and all of the little bits and pieces. I could just use my creativity in a new way. And I tell people that, and they're like, genuinely, at first they're genuinely stunned, but the more they think about it, the more they realize it makes sense. Like, that makes a ton of sense because, you know, I'm notoriously not someone who likes being graded, and that's why, because those don't serve me as well as they served every other kid. There's a thing that goes around from, like, the internet, and it says, and it's a joke of, like, I'm different. But nobody actually thinks about what that actually means, what being built different could actually look like. But when you are, it's not always the advantage that people want to believe it will be. Eventually, you'll in some, different place in your life where, you know, about the world and your introspection will, I don't know, help you analyze media to the extent that you can offer something meaningful as a anime podcaster on the internet, hopefully. Not set the bar on the ground, but or times very many other things, you know, so many of the professions that we rely on are occupied very often by people who didn't do well in early life because none of it was set up for them specifically to succeed. You look at artists, you look at designers, you look at chefs, you look at the creative professions that build our lives around us, and they're not, the people in them are like, you know, chefs are described as pirates who happen to make food, you know, are allowed to be weird and crazy and kooky, and even many times bordering on, you know, for the only thing they're good for is their art, or even worse, I'd say worse there because I don't think that lots of people who are considered savants are really all that bad at other things. They're just so exceptional at the thing that they're focused on that everything else in comparison seems so mundane that it is almost a disappointment when people realize, like, oh, person who can write an incredible concerto, like, just microwave burritos for well, yeah, so do you, but you can't make the concerto, bud. And the there is that very oftentimes the world isn't actually set up to be a place of success for people who are different. And in Yusuke's case, going to his wake made him see that regardless of his feeling of inadequacy, because that's what you see in him as an early character, he cared for, he is loved, he is valued. People don't just want him in their lives, they need him in his lives, but not in the way that, like, you need a good plumber. In the way that you need, you know, who you admire and challenge, in the way that you need the boy you grew up around and is your crush, in the way that you need your child, in the way that you need, you know, who has a heart of gold but can't seem to get it together to care to go to class because his mother is a, you know, most of the time. You know, they're as important, those needs are as important as the plumber, as the good student, as the perfect boyfriend, as all the best friend, as all of it. Those relationships matter and are deep in the same way that you normally consider other traditionally more quote-unquote valuable relationships. But here's the question I'm going to pose to you. What if you died and you didn't get to see that? What if you lived, not even Yusuke's life, but you lived a worse life? If you lived a life that by the end was more miserable than his was, more than Yusuke's was, you know, not pathetic, but tortured. What if your life had taken a turn, not for like the way you think of traditionally, where you like end up in prison or like you get dumped and sad, but something happens to you and there's a compounding that you're not built to come back from. That's what and that fatal incident, or that series of fatal incidents, you're sent down a path that feels like a hole of depression and self-loathing and doubt and rage that you never come back from before you die. What if your life and what if that caused your life to stop at a fixed point when you were a teenager and you never recovered, and then you died and were reincarnated? And so that's what happens to Rudy. And where lots of isekai, because Jobless Reincarnation isn't just an isekai, but it's largely, the original story is largely attributed with being the kind of the modern isekai. Like, lots of people will watch the show and see things that feel derivative, but they just don't realize that this property, before it was animated, did those things first. But happened to Rudy in his previous life. I don't even think they give you his full name. It presented as being so visceral and so scarring and so heavy on his soul and psyche that it to inform every inch of him. He takes the escapism he seeks, the crimes he commits in his former life are crimes rooted from the fact that he was stopped, that his life stopped long before he died. And the way the show shows that he died is that Rudy died in his former life. That there was still a good person in there somewhere. It reveals that through all of the grossness and all of the badness had been built around him, the guy who stood up for the girl in, by the way, spoilers for all of Jobless from here on out, the guy who stood up for the girl in the lunch line when punks cut in front of her because they didn't care about the rules, is still there. The world had a cruelty that stopped him from progressing beyond that. And the show shows him as a shithead on some level. And the show later reveals that he was that in his former life, he installed cameras in his younger female cousin's room to spy on her. And it's presented as this incredibly invasive, incredibly disgusting thing. And it was a shithead. He was a real piece of work. He was this languishing on his family. But what was also true is that at a point in the flashbacks, you never see anyone really helping him, really fighting the cruelty that he was lashing back with. They all gave up. And this is a thing that can, a bummer to talk to for long enough, you stop talking to them. If someone lashes out at you for long enough, you stop talking to them. You stop choosing to interact with those people because it's so draining for you to deal with someone who is so clearly pointing their animus, disappointment, and rage with the rest of the world at you that you internally figure, well, why the fuck should I deal with this person? It's not my fault that they got shit on. Why should I be the punching bag? And it takes a lot to continuously be that punching bag and go back. And it takes a lot of belief in the other person, remembering that the other person is someone you truly care about, to go in and deal with it, to go in and talk to the people in our lives. And it's hard. And it's a kind of hard that lots of people don't value doing, and not really to their own fault, don't value thinking about doing or attempting after a while, because that badness, that thing at core that causes those things to lash out, that cause people to lash out at us, the people in our lives who are in a bad place, to lash out at us for no reason, that thing is possible for all of us to build up. It's possible for all of us to experience. And it's possible for all of us to feel, even at a distance. You look at a stranger and you know having a bad day. Now imagine you know a lot more about that person and you absolutely, with certainty, know that their life is a festering pile of shit right now. It's hard to be near that, and there's a reason that psychiatrists and psychologists go to psychiatry and psychology themselves. It's because being the kind of people's badness and people's damage and people's trauma can be a lot, and it can affect you. It can affect the people who are acting as those outlets just as much as it affects the people who have it. And if you never deal with that, and I'm not going to frame this in the idea of strength, because I don't think that strength enters into it. I don't think that Rudeus was a weak person in his former life. I think that he was a normal person who was just outside of the bounds of what everyone else would accept enough to be bullied for it. So his previous life, Rudeus was an overweight kid at the of his life. At the point of his life where his life branches off from being kind of a kid's life to being truly tormented and like someone who wasn't just bullied but who was tortured as a teenager by other asshole teenagers. And the show does not shy away from this. It shows him, chained up to the front gate of the school naked. And he is so scarred by this because, sociopathically when they are really cruel often. And he never recovered from that incident, and it started to spiral, and it started to feel worse and worse until a friend of his brought it up and was trying to lighten his load, but maybe wasn't as deft as he could be, and Rudeus lashes out at him. And then that relationship falls away because that kid said probably what all of us say in those situations, like, this shit isn't my fault. I'm just trying to lighten the load. But he didn't come back. He didn't insist on himself back in Rudeus' life. And Rudeus didn't, to devil's advocate, Rudeus didn't seek him out either. And it says as much in the show. But what happens when that person gets a second chance at life? What happens when someone who is so tormented that they become a hikikomori, aka they cloister themselves permanently in their room, gets a second chance? Will he make every choice perfectly? No. Will he be, ever could be? Probably not. Because he stopped living at a point. He didn't make the full rotation. He didn't end up getting a job or being someone who was fully present in the world. He became a kind of living dead, not even walking because he wasn't walking around. As a disabled person, I have this real need to go out into the world once a day because I think it's important for people to see me, for me to see people, for me to be, even if I'm not going to talk to anybody, for me to be around others, for me to be out in the world, because as anybody listening to this knows, it's really easy to not do that right now. And it's been really easy to not do that for a long time. Case in point, written a long time ago, but it was adapted in 2021, and it still makes sense. Like, the hikikomori as a cultural thing in Japan has been around for a long time. And so it's been possible for a long time. And I do that is because I want to keep my because I want to make sure that I never feel so comfortable cloistered away that I never interact with the world. I also think it's important that, like, see disabled people, and people see not only disabled people, but disabled people with, like, and ability to move through the world with grace that very often people don't think of people with disabilities as. Most people who have met me very quickly discount my disability or even forget it's there because I don't project that. And not even like I'm not projecting. Some of that is on purpose, but most of it is just I'm comfortable in my own skin. I'm not going to, I don't mind I'm me. Yes, I know I'm disabled, but that doesn't enter into, like, going to get lunch or, anything I do. At the same point, once again, not once again, the entire world is kind of hostile to people with only one hand or any kind of disability for that matter. But if you get comfortable enough, and it's easy to get comfortable, it's very comfortable not being perceived or only doing the perceiving and not coming the other direction. You can get really comfortable and, like, you can wallow in that sadness and that dread and all of those things. And so that's the character who's at the base of where Rudy starts when he's born. And the show designing Rudy as often as the main character certainly, but oftentimes an unlikable character in some respects, is telling you, hey, this is him because he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know who he could be because at a point he stopped knowing, he stopped looking, he stopped moving forward entirely in his old life. And so yes, you're getting this character who is a fully formed, you get, just this young child's body into a baby who is a 30-something and who has, well-read and has, life into, and that helps him in the world of Mushoku Tensei. But he doesn't have the interpersonal part. He doesn't know what to do at certain points. He doesn't have the depth of knowledge. And this is something that, lots of people now don't have, to be fair to Rudy entirely. There was a meme on TikTok a while ago. Actually, it's still kind of rotating a little bit, but not as much as it was when I first saw it. It was most of my TikTok feed there for a while. And it's the Gen Z stare. And Gen Z says one thing, and, Gen X say another thing. But when everybody stops to think about it, what's happening there is you have a generation of people who grew up and their socialization was fucked, for lack of a better term. They didn't get the base, they weren't forced to get a baseline before COVID hit, and they were all forced to say and forced to have technology mediate their every interaction. There's this thing on Twitter, we'll never call it X, and now even, that people say stuff to each other on those platforms that they would never say in real life. You would never say things like you say to people online in real life. Because in real life, even if it's only a look, there's a consequence to it. The closer we all get to talking to face to each other, the more consequences there are to saying dumb shit to another person. And that makes people uncomfortable. But when you don't have that uncomfortability for long enough, you don't learn how to be, you don't learn the cues, you don't learn the of talking to another person. You don't get the negative, but you also don't get the positives. And it becomes hard to relate to other people. An episode of Evangelion, actually, that talks a lot, I think it's called The Hedgehog's Dilemma is the name of the episode. And it talks about, it's really difficult to relate to other people. And it, reveals, the EF fields in Evangelion represent people kind of from others. And it's this, meditation on what it's like to be depressed and what it's like to, be and kind of through, out into the world at other people who seem like they're perfectly fine, even though they're not, just like everybody isn't. But in Rudeus' case, like a lot of Gen Z people, his training, if you want to think about it that way, stopped at a certain point. So he formed habits that don't jive with everybody, that are harmful, bad, crude, gross. And he formed them in the acts of doing something that meant of doing things that made him try to chase escapism, made him try to chase companionship from anything, made him try to have kind of good feeling in his life that was never enough, because it could never be enough, because he most likely couldn't deal with the damage and no one was helping him. And there's a great scene at the tail end of the first season where he is at loggerheads with Paul, his dad. And lots of people hate Paul also. I'll get to Paul in a minute. But he pauses and he says, I'm not going to fuck this up this time. I'm not going to let this go bad. And he consciously makes an opening for the other person. And in that moment, he becomes a better person than he was in his old life. In lots of moments, he becomes a better person than he was in his old life. But up until then, he was given the benefit of a doubt that I don't think that enough of us give each other. when you look at a child, unless they do something unspeakably evil, like kill an entire city block, you don't look at a child in the same way with the same and put the same values and balances on a child's actions or behaviors that you do on a adult. You give them room to fail. You give them room to make wrong choices. You give them room to commit social faux pas that you don't afford other people. You know, they get frustrated with me, and he'll say, like, you know, why can't you man up? And I'd like give him, like, I'm mean, and I don't say this to him, but I think it every time. What do you mean, man up? What does that mean? What is, like, that? Do you mean be full of bravado and overconfident and bowl through situations the way that, you know, times manning up seems to look like? Do you mean be thoughtful and depth in your perception and interaction with the situation? That doesn't mean anything. It means something to you, I'm sure, but it doesn't mean anything in the abstract by itself. And very often, if you let that sit there, it's gonna mean something negative. It's gonna be chauvinistic in some way. But if you're really giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, if you really pause, let the emotion of the situation drain out, and you say, hold on, let's just talk to each other like people and stop holding each other to whatever standard we have in our heads that we don't even meet, even though we want to believe that we do, but may not even actually ever in our best moments, then we can not just get past this, but like grow it in a way that's meaningful, and we come out better people with better understanding of not only each other but ourselves. And in the moment when Rudeus says, I'm not going to fuck this up with his dad, he does that. And all throughout the show up until that point, people are giving him the benefit of the doubt because he's a child. They are allowing his cheeky behavior. They are permitting it to a point that you would permit a child behavior. A case in point, you know, like in like a we'd call a kid for spying on her while she's changing. It's fundamentally gross, but because it's an adult interacting with a kid, you handle it differently. It becomes a different kind of interaction than if it was the 34-year-old man, the 34-year-old, like, overweight, you know, who Rudy was. And that little bit of leeway gets him the kind of grace that was missing at the end of his life. And as he goes through the story, which I'm kind of vague here, he things that you don't see a lot of, that in like a power fantasy, see something like SAO. Characters don't really experience, they only experience just a slight hint of. But comparatively, for every good thing that happens to Rudeus, something immeasurably bad happens. You know, Roxy, and he meets, what's his name? His wife, elf girl. And then immediately his father sends him away. He adjusts to that environment, and a mana disaster teleports everybody to all corners of the world, and he's now stuck with Eris, this like absolute raging bitch who barely got to trusting him in the first place, and then he climbs his way out of that hole. So much of the show is him continuously falling down into these like deep depressions, but the world giving him a way to pick himself up. And I think a lot of it also is obviously writing, but you don't notice the writing so much because it feels like the world is responding to him and responding to this idea that, like, in the very early part of his life in this show, when he is like young, when he is like, you know, like 5, 6, 7, he left the grounds of his house. He hasn't gone outside his gate in his village, and he's really worried and really scared until, like, Roxy, his teacher, who in infinite wisdom is like, look, I'm barely qualified to teach you, kid. Takes him out off the premises for his final test. And eventually he develops a really unhealthy, like, relationship, Roxy, that borderline, like, religious around his a pair of her underwear that he steals when he's a kid. But, he him out of his cloister, her dragging him out, metaphorically and slightly physically, proves to him that he's not who he was, that all he had to do was leave. And yeah, he had to push, but he is forever grateful to the person who gave him that push, who pushed him to leave the nest, to pushed him to, like, step out of the thing he built around himself, metaphorically. And, you know, at every point in the show, when he's at his, like, deepest place, he sinks back to that, and he reminds himself that he did this once already, and, like, he'd have the strength. Not once again, strength is the wrong word. He didn't take the step to leave. He couldn't never bring himself to go back to school. And he finds it in himself to do that again. And all the, like, problems have with, you know, Paul are rooted in this want for a power fantasy character who has this kind of perfection that is in, like, traditional shonen characters. Think Goku, think Gon Point from Hunter, but only to a point that's very important. Think if you want to think of a, like, isekai, but show isn't interested in that. It's not interested in giving you the power fantasy without giving you not even the power fantasy, but the fantasy without the consequences. And yeah, there are like, this does delve into, like, really jokes and, like, all the other stuff, but it never made without the understanding that where Rudeus came from was an impossibly dark place, a kind of depression that he never got out of. He never had the opportunity to get out of because the world around him wasn't capable of helping him get out of it. And make no mistake, getting out of, like, needing isn't a bad thing. You should never think that you have the strength to just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That very phrase is impossible. You can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You're standing in the boots. Somebody else needs to help. And if you don't think that, you haven't hit that kind of rock bottom yet, bud. Or you have, and someone helped you out, and you don't really realize it. And so when people rag on Rudeus, or rag on Rudeus as the main character and how gross he seems and how, like, lurid he is, I'm like, he is. He was left alone in a hole to rot for over a decade. What do you think it looks like when you think would happen? Do you think you get, you know, from Lord of the Rings? Or do you think you get Gollum? Because 9 times out of 10, you get Gollum. You know, great saying I like. And that is that heroes aren't extraordinary people. They are normal people. It goes something like this. Heroes aren't extraordinary people. They are normal people who don't have any choices left. Except the thing that people don't realize is that doing nothing is a choice. You're sitting and doing nothing is a choice you make. And sometimes you make that choice because it feels just slightly less worse, not better, less worse than what you are afraid the alternative might be. And like I said, when people judge Rudeus, I think they're forgetting that, because this is such an epic, even by the end of the first season, much less the end of the second season, that I totally forgot that they put in an entire thing in the very beginning of the show where he dies. And you see what happened to him. They don't super detail it out, but they tell you very clearly and very precisely, this is essentially a guy who was tortured to no fault of his own because he spoke up to some especially shitty assholes. And then he was left to languish and rot and fester for decades. That's not a thing that makes you a good person. You have to do a lot of work to get to be a better person. More work than you might ever be able to accomplish in your whole life. And now I want to talk about kind of other side of the coin, Paul. And big spoilers here. If you haven't seen the end of the current run of Mushoku Tensei, you might want to stop watching/listening here. But when you first encounter Paul as a character, he's very much portrayed as like a guy who's doing his best and who is out of his depths. I saw the Fantastic Four movie, and there's this great scene in it where, you know, is revealed to be pregnant with her and Reeve child, and Johnny looks at sister Sue and says, "You're going to be an incredible mother. I have no doubt." And he turns to Reeve Richards and he says, "You, however, are out of your depths. You have no idea what you're doing. It's gonna suck for you." And he ended up largely being kind of and the same is kind of true of Paul. Like, Paul pretty quickly revealed to not know what he's doing, to be doing his best, but even with a normal kid, he would be out of his depths. But he doesn't have a normal kid. He has Rudy, a kid who is quietly, to no one's knowledge except for his, the reincarnation of a full-grown adult who, you know, has life, even if it was a piece of shit of one, and who has, like, judgments passed on Paul, which are much fairer and balanced, and more balanced, because he recognizes Paul as a shithead, because Paul is a shithead, and we'll get to why in a second. But he cuts him some slack, and he says, "You know what, shithead, I was definitely a real piece of shit in my day too, Paul. It's not, like, I'm not going to judge you for that." But then Paul fucks up majorly. He sleeps with the maid, and the maid gets pregnant. And what Rudy does is expressly not for Paul. He expressly does it for the maid, and he does it for the maid because the maid had shown him kindness and grace and all of these other things, and he does it for her because he genuinely worried for her safety. And, like, basically a truth, a throuple situation, if you will, with Paul, the maid, and Dennis, Rudy's. And then he's sent away, and then the mana disaster happens, and Paul and Rudeus's relationship is cast in stone permanently at that point. And Paul, even though Paul's a shithead, he has this, like, honor, do as I say, not as I do-ness to him. He's trying his hardest. He's really trying his best to raise Rudy right and raise Rudy to be everything he can be. And Rudy realizes by the end of the second season that it's exactly what Paul did. Like, Paul gave him the tools that he never got in his old life to, you know, keep moving forward and dig himself out of every hole that he falls into, no matter how deep. And he just has to kind of himself and grab the shovel as tight as he can. And the show kills Paul on Father's Day. That's a thing they do on purpose. Everybody in the show's fandom is like, "Look, man, I've hated Paul for a long time, but did you have to kill Paul on Father's Day, you assholes?" It goes suddenly and such force right when him and Rudy were in a good place finally, and, like, had this thing of, like, you up and didn't, like, your father fucked up and you didn't have a real relationship when you were kids, but now that you're adults, you seem to have something like closeness. And right when they had gotten his wife, Rudy's mother back, right when they've gotten Dennis back, even though she's not the person she was, he done, and lots of other, like, shitty in this show. A kind of this show is that no one's quite the good person you want them to be. From the entire Greyrat household to family and household and name, basically the Greyrats are different shades of shitty, ranging from Paul, who's just kind of shithead throughout his own life and kind of interacted with Paul for long enough. It's like, look at him like they actively don't like him. To his cool you find out later on in the show is basically kidnapping and grooming people to be his personal harem, which is gross as hell, to adults. Most of the adults in the show are fucked. But the show doesn't. The show at no point says, oh, these are bad guys, so you should see them as bad guys. When you first meet the cousin character, Eris, who ends up dying off screen, they reveal him to be really realistic, but ultimately seemingly like a good person. He throws a birthday party for Rudeus. He welcomes Rudeus into his home against his better judgment. He does all of these things that are honorable and noble and meaningful. But, like I said, you find out that he's kidnapping adolescent beast people and training them to be his personal harem. There's no two ways about that. He's a sex trafficker. Not even mincing words there. He's a sex trafficker. You know, tendency to make bad people into monsters because that's what we want them to be, and that's what so much of media treats them as. You know, Superman movie. Nicholas' portrayal of Lex Luthor is spot on, but Lex Luthor has like no qualities. He's not a good person. And more than that, he's like risen level of monster because he's like jailing ex-girlfriends in another dimension because they tweeted something mean about him one time. Like, give space for redemption there. In this show, everyone has done something wrong because everybody does stuff wrong, you know, real life, and sometimes you get the hand you're dealt. Sometimes to continue mixing this gambling metaphor, the dice fall where they will, and you don't get everything right. Even as Rudy's growing through his damage, he still gets things wrong. You know, he pushes away and unintentionally hurt to the point where everyone will, like, people who were really kind to him at the outset look at him with cruelty in their eyes for a period of time. Eventually they come around and they realize, like, oh, it's a big misunderstanding, but we can't fix this. It may not be fixable. Sarah may never come around, and I don't think you ever hear from her again. But that damage, that broken relationship persists. You know, in characters, we want characters who are on the good guy's side to always make the right choices. And in reality, if you're writing something well enough, they'll always do their best, but they won't make the grade. Sometimes the system won't let them succeed. Sometimes it's not the power fantasy you wanted it to be. I think the mistake that you make going into the show is thinking of it as another power fantasy isekai. It's not a power fantasy isekai. It's a second chance one. It's a mulligan on an old life and living a new one. Are you going to get it? Does Rudeus get everything right? No. He's lucky sometimes if he gets most of it right. And the show, especially in the first season when they show him on the Demon Continent, makes a real point of like showing that there's consequences to getting it wrong. So at least when he gets it wrong, he feels it and he tries to grow from it, even if he can't fix it. I think there's real value in that. It's not fantastically power trippy. It does have elements of that. Like, at the end of the day, the guy still gets 3 wives and, like, you know, sleep with them all and they all share him and blah, blah, blah. That's not without sacrifice and not without pain and all the things that come with living a life. And even one of those wives, Roxy, you know, him and not falls for him because she's clearly fallen for him way before that. But she takes advantage of him when he's at his lowest. His, at that point, current wife, Sophia, whose name I finally remember, Sophie, just kind of, and she, like, pauses, and she's like, you know, I thought this would happen at some point. You're you. That's just the thing that's true. Didn't think that you'd get taken advantage of. And that's how this would happen. But, you know, what happens, you're to be part of the family. Apparently, this is a Greyrat tradition of sorts now. Except Rudy gets one more than his dad. But I think if you go into this thing, I know if you go into this show wanting the pure wish fulfillment fantasy, that it will do that. It will absolutely do that. It's about that. It does that. But the character of Rudy and kind of all other characters will rub you the wrong way. And yes, there are some fundamental things about this show that are not great. It has not great opinions about women. It has not great, like, anglings of women and, like, all the stuff that's wrong with anime. But I think it has a fundamental honesty to its characters. Its characters are not perfect. They are flawed in large and small ways. They have, but, and I've been thinking about this a lot with, incursion, that's the way I can describe it, of, Annie, the, like, very, very obsessive, love-bombing nightmare AI that, Elon put out into the world as a kind of, like, part of Grok. That dial's turned up to 11. For most of the companion AIs you can get access to, it's one or the other. It's nice friend who can be kind of flirty and fun, or sex robot. Annie is fully on the sex robot side. Trust me, it's not hard to get there. You don't need to try hard. But the reality is somewhere in the middle. The reality is to have characters that feel real and make you feel like you have a relationship with them, even though they're not real, need to be capable of the full range. And I understand why people don't want characters to have that full range, because it's not healthy to have those unchecked relationships, and we don't know what, and like we are starting to have a framework for what this does to people's brains, aka AI chat GPT psychosis, I think they call it. But writing those characters with one side or the other means that they're incomplete. If you watch your standard, isekai, the characters feel hollow. They feel like they are stand-in characters for the viewer in a way that's not helpful. The fact that people don't like Rudeus proves that he's not a stand-in for anyone. He's not built to be the like for Monster Musume or Kirito from Sword Art Online. You are not meant to be Rudeus if you want to put yourself into this world. And I think that's a serious accomplishment. And I mentioned this in the beginning, but Studio Bind was built to make this show. It's a co-collaboration between Studio White and the Studio Egg firm to make a thing that can handle larger budget, more intense and stretched out projects. And the second from them, or the latest thing from them, is a show called Roy Rock that is also hilariously adhered to the same Mushoku adheres to, which is you have to be a weird kind of make truly beautiful art. Which Mushoku Tensei and both kind of out in some serious ways that make it very possibly true on some level. But I can see why they wanted to do this justice, because if you read through this show, and there are many people love this show but hate Rudeus, then I don't think they get it, really. Because the show isn't the same if you fix the parts of Rudeus that are damaged. Like, if you take away Rudeus's, horniness, is only that aggressive until he gets a shot with the women of his dreams. Once he comes together with, that, wanderings of his lust narrows to only her. And she, she's like, I'm you too. This is part of you. I'm here for it. 900%. 1,000% here for it. And his second wife, Roxy, literally takes advantage of it. And also, when he encounters her, he has this, he is tortured about it, because to him, Roxy isn't, to him, his wife, is his first love, his first friend, his first relationship that is on equal terms and that is important to him. But Roxy, to him, is a religious figure. She is the thing that kept him driving forward. and he doesn't know how to handle that. But at that point, Sylphette is pregnant with his first child, and he understands, like, I adore Roxy, but I love Sylphette, and and those are different emotions, maybe expressed in some of the same ways, but there's a very clear line in his head until, once again, Roxy takes advantage of him, and, like, the stuff just falls apart, like, on top of him, basically. And by the end of, and this is where I'm going to leave it, by the end of the recent season, he seems like he's matured in a way. I don't know how they work, Eris into the equation, but I know they do eventually. But, because I haven't read the manga, I've been watching the show and kind of away from the manga. Like, I have spoilers online, but I don't care about them that hard. But he doesn't take his request to add Roxy to the roster, to the harem roster, so to speak, lightly. And Sylphette doesn't take it lightly. But she welcomes Roxy because Sylphette knows what Roxy means to the person she loves. She knows that Roxy is the thing that is, not even the person, but the thing that moved Rudeus through everything to get back to her. And I've talked about this before, and really where I'm going to leave it, there's multiple ways to express love and to experience love and to be in love and to be with a person, and a lot of it has to do with confidence and confidence in yourself and confidence in your partner and their choices. This is not an open relationship scenario. This is inviting this person in. And I'm not going to rail against or support, like, any kind of variant of relationships or monogamy or polygamy or any of that crap. But love is, directions. I've said this phrase before, but there's a great phrase that says, love is just friendship on fire. And I think Roxy, Rudeus, and Sylphette, and eventually Eris understand that. And it, don't get twisted, all of them understand that in direction towards each other and towards each other multiple. And I know that that's a big part of the wish fulfillment thing, and, like, lots of people have problems with it and all this other stuff. But because they feel like, no, one of the harem girls has to win. But I think the show does a good job of grounding it. Because it does a good job of being like, no, this is what all of us have chosen. And if one of us doesn't want to choose it, we are fully capable of having that conversation and a way through that. But we all are choosing this. And on that note, this is actually where I'm going to end it. If you want to watch Mushoku, aka Jobless Reincarnation, it's available over on Crunchyroll. So you can go check it out. Both seasons that are currently out are both subbed and dubbed. I watch it dubbed because I'm lazy mostly, and because it's got a lot of technical jargon, especially in that second half, that don't cook your brain a little to read. But you can definitely go check it out there. I encourage you to, if you've even the faintest interest in it, give it a shot, because at the very least, it's a thing that has had tons of production and money poured into it. If you like the show, be sure to check it out on YouTube. If you're listening to it, I don't think this one will get struck. And I'm kind of sure it won't. But, because I'm trying to be on my best behavior. But if you want to subscribe to the show as a podcast and listen to it week to week, you can do that in your podcast player of choice. Anywhere you're hearing me right now, you can subscribe to me. But on that note, I have been Alex. This has been Bento Radio, and I will talk to you next time.